I just stubbed my toe. Alright, I guess that's how this is starting. With his first episode released on October 13th of 2023, The Amazing Digital Circus took the World Wide Web by storm, garnering over 100 million views in what felt like no time at all. It was clear that its creator, Gooseworks, had captured lightning in a bottle. But for me, this actually wasn't my first experience with the show. A little over 3 years ago was when I first saw the animations that would make up Goose's Meet the Gang video. At the time, I thought the art style was interesting, and I loved the physical comedy that was showcased. However, I was nearing the end of my time in university, and I really did have to buckle down to finish out strong. Those short animations quickly slipped from my mind. Fast forward a few months, and the trailers and teasers for the Digital Circus were beginning to crop up again, and I was blown away. Those less than a minute animations, they'd been transformed into an entire show. It was just kind of incredible to me, and I felt really happy for all those involved in the project. Now, nearly 3 years later, and the show is officially over. A lot has changed in that time. For the show, the production values have soared through the roof, and they even earned themselves a streaming deal with Netflix to boot. For us on the outside, life certainly has thrown a lot of changes our way. I can't speak to everyone's own personal developments, but I can say for myself that I've finished college, started job hunting, and have found myself stuck in a rut of seasonal work and debating whether I should go back and get my master's degree. While I may be just one man, it is impossible to deny that many in my generation and the generation before us are facing similar struggles. We are in a trying age of job market stagnation, with job loss in the United States alone being in the tens of thousands and unemployment rates rising over 4%. There are many obvious targets one could dole out blame to for this job crisis, like generative AI and language learning models or other sources. But that's not what this video is about. For what it's worth, and for what the show is trying to say, I think that The Amazing Digital Circus came out at the perfect time for many of us. And while I'm not too big a fan of creators having to spell out themes and such outside of the show, it probably helped out quite a few people to understand what lens to view the show with. Anyway, I think Caine put it best, let's just skip the melodrama and get right to the fun! Welcome to my exploration of the Amazing Digital Circus, and my review for its finale.
Holy shit.
There's meaning to be found in a stagnant life. When asked what message Gooseworks wanted people to take away from the show, this was the response they gave. Despite its simplicity, I do think there is a beauty to it. Now, obviously there are other lessons to be taken from the show. A study of Jax's character would probably produce dozens, like why opening up to your friends is important, or how to properly check for a pulse. However, I wanted to examine this one first since the words came straight from the Goose's mouth. All throughout the show, examples of this message can be seen bleeding through the cracks. Ragatha's talk of having a routine and the dangers of chasing an unobtainable goal. Kinger telling Pomni to cherish the people around her. Even Jax's refusal to acknowledge the human complexity around him and anyone else feeds into the messaging. And once the last 2 episodes of the show rolled around, Gooseworks was practically beating the lesson over people's heads. When I watched the last act in theaters, I was very relieved that the neural scans were brought up as quickly as they were. There was definitely no way to beat around the bush with that one. The Soma theory, as people were calling it, was right, with them all being copied consciouses in a digital plane. Although Jax didn't have to be such a dick about it to Zooble, throwing their words back in their face from the previous episode. In any case, with escape from the circus now definitively being impossible and Caine not around anymore to craft adventures for them, the time had come for the last act to make Goose's message manifest. And, at first, we see exactly that. Everyone is in some way, shape, or form broken by Kinger's news, with Zooble and Ragatha visibly taking it the worst out of everyone. Even Pomni, after a brief bout of putting up a strong front, is unable to mask her own fear and grief. She breaks down. But Kinger is there for her. Calling back to episode 3, Kinger reminds her of the strength she has demonstrated both in her receptiveness to the circus and her ability to form connections with others. And this isn't just Kinger saying this. We as an audience have been on this journey with Pomni and have been able to watch her grow and develop as the show has gone on. In a digital world overseen by an uncompromising and partially insane overlord, what better way is there to find meaning than by forming human connections? Our relationships to others are a large part of how we define ourselves as people. Mother, father, sister, brother, husband, wife, partner, friend. There's a reason that these are some of the most common words you hear in eulogies to pull from a more of a morbid source. It's impossible to summarize an entire life in a palatable way. So instead, we do so by recognizing the connections that person made along the way. Of course, the show did have some issues with getting this aspect of what I believe its message to be across. It can be fairly easily argued that Pomni really only managed to connect with Jax and Ragatha. With Kinger, it's more difficult to say, as most of the time, the absolute king among men isn't even lucid to his surroundings. And when it comes to Gengal and Zubul, well, those two were certainly a pair, especially if the end credits were anything to go off on. But it's through their pairing that we see the fruit of relationships and the positives of opening up to others bloom. It is unfortunate, but it is true that Pomni never really had a one-on-one interaction with Zubul. However, it is with Gengal that we are able to see the start of Pomni's journey in becoming the character she blossoms into. Gengal is the first member of the circus who Pomni reaches out to without needing any prompting from outside forces. Sure, she's pretty awkward about it at first. I mean, who wouldn't be after an all-day shift in the service industry? In fact, she seems to drive an even bigger wedge between them after mentioning Ragatha. But Pomni doesn't let that deter her. She reaches out again, not letting Gengal shut her out, and proves that her words weren't empty platitudes. She was being genuine in her support. And it was because of that one small act of kindness that Pomni earned the trust of Gengal, and by proxy, the implicit trust of Zubul. Though the entire cast of the Digital Circus operates on a much smaller scale than the rest of humanity, this wrinkle of complexity from these characters' relationships encapsulates a great deal about how communities actually function. Not everyone is as connected to some as they are to others, but there are often overlaps in these small communities within communities. And sometimes, when there's more that connects these two groups than was previously seen, it leads to the two merging, becoming one, and bringing about new relationships that were previously unimagined. That or they can just stay as friends of a friend. That works too. Either way, Pomni over the course of the show has driven herself to form these meaningful connections with each and every member of the circus. Though she struggled at first, as seen in the second and third episodes, she still managed to build the foundations of meaningful human connection with the people around her. And it is because of her efforts and the trust she's forged that she is able to pull them all through this crisis. The world may be shattered in grayscale, but they're all they have now. And that's good enough, because what is more human than finding meaning in your relationships and connections with others? Which is why it should have come as no surprise that Jax, the character who defined themselves by denying their humanity and severing every connection they could, ended up abstracting. When talking about Jax and their status in the Amazing Digital Circus, it would be difficult not to mention the criticism of how central to the show they became over time. Maybe if the series had been given more time to breathe, Jax's turn from love-hateable sociopath to secondary pillar of the show's themes wouldn't have felt so jarring. Outside of pacing issues in the show, though, I do have to wonder if the outcry wouldn't have been as vitriolic had Gooseworks not put out that character episode roadmap. Thankfully, I get to do one of my favorite things and disagree with the mad ravings of those mired in fandom. For a show like The Amazing Digital Circus, with a focus on character development and relationships to function, a character like Jax is necessary in order to provide juxtaposition and reflection for the rest of the cast. Putting it another way, if you were to take each of the characters' central issues, sprinkle on a little abandonment trauma and toxic masculinity, and roll it up into a ball, you would have Jax. They are the mirror that the viewer is meant to view the rest of the cast with. Outside of the finale, we can see this most clearly when Jax is paired with Gengal. Both of them have masking as a core part of their character arcs and how they define their relationships with others. For Gengal, it is out of the fear of seeing herself as unworthy of love because of her anxiety, depression, feelings of inadequacy. etc. For Jax, their masking is out of a desperation to keep others at an arm's length, playing up the role of the comedic relief cartoon character in order to hide away from their own humanity. However, it is Gangle's ability to open herself up to others that allows her to become more than just her mask. Right from the get-go, Jax took special care in solidifying Gangle's archetype upon her entering the circus. She was the sad one, the pathetic one. It's pretty easy to infer what sort of relationship the two had before Zubul arrived, from hints given by other characters and of how Jax's own twisted subconscious viewed her. Whether purposefully or not, Jax was mimicking the bullshit machismo relationship of their father and mother, at least before Daddy left. It's part of the reason that whenever Jax was questioned or accused of being malicious to Gangle, that they genuinely seemed to believe that she enjoyed this about their relationship. In reality, all Gangle was to Jax was a toxic replacement for Ribbit. Beyond replacing one of their only friends with someone who would never bother trying to get Jax to open up, it was here that Jax's worldview surrounding archetypes began to form, and how they were the one to morph the circus to fit it. Kinger was always crazy. Ragatha's trauma, both old and new, caused her to develop her compulsion for making sure everyone was fine and happy, even at her own detriment. And Jax put the work in themselves to ensure Gangle remained miserable. It sure was convenient for Jax too. Having someone more miserable than them around probably helped to distract them from their own misery, or at least make it more tolerable. All of that changed though because of Zubul and Pomni. Both of them threw a spanner into the works of the circus, breaking the status quo and shifting the balance of personalities. Zubul refused to go on Caine's adventures, and slowly but surely managed to pull Gangle out of her shell and away from Jax's influence. Pomni, meanwhile, adapted quickly to the state of the circus, and allowed herself to go with the flow of everything that was happening around her. Between Jax's favorite plaything being taken away, and not being able to pin Pomni down into a specific archetype, we see their worldview begin to fracture, and them beginning to abstract. Over and over, from episode 6 to 8, Jax's worldview keeps getting chipped away at, revealing the layers hidden underneath their facade. None of the circus members are beholden to their archetypes. There are still those who want to reach out and know them, and the mistakes of their past don't have to define them. All of this culminates in Kinger revealing their involvement in the creation of Caine, and subsequently the circus. That was the final nail in the coffin for Jax. All of this was real. But then, just as Kinger had been the one to shatter Jax, he was also the one to seal Jax's fate. After what must have only been a few hours at most of sitting with that revelation, Jax and the rest of the cast were blindsided by the news of the neural scans. Jax had been right. They all really were just a bunch of cartoon characters. At least, that's how Jax saw it. From that point on, there was no other way forward for Jax other than abstraction. They had lost too much. There was too much guilt to bear, and none of it even mattered in the first place. But all of it mattered, but none of it was real. But it was real to Jax. They had finally opened up to someone, and then they pushed that person away and made them abstract. They pushed both of the people who loved him into abstraction. The worst thing Kinger said anyone could do in that world where they were just a bunch of ones and zeros, a world that Jax doesn't deserve, that would be better without them in it. Nothing that Jax could have done would have ever excused the things they had done. However, that does not mean they deserve their fate. Knowing that abstraction is a thinly veiled metaphor for it tore at my heart to see what became of Jax. And when Pomni dove into the abstracted Jax's shattered psyche, part of me wished that she would have been able to pull them back. But that's not what her mission there was about. It was a last-ditch attempt at some kind of understanding of Jax, along with Pomni trying her best to bring them some kind of peace, to find meaning in their death. Unfortunately, that wasn't the final note in the ballad of Jax's tragedy. So far in this review, I haven't really done much reviewing, which some of you might have picked up on. Personally, I would say that the show wrapped itself up quite nicely with a bittersweet touch. This finale had done a pretty decent job at tying up loose ends, as well as providing a conclusion to the show's main thesis. If I were to rate it, I would give it a 3.5 stars out of 5, with my only big issue being the same critique I hold for the rest of the show, that being its pacing and feeling that more time was needed for the characters to breathe. Oh, and the fact that Caine was still alive. Okay, let's just rip the band-aid off on this one. Other than that one guy in the back of my theater shouting, "What the fuck?" I did not like the reveal that Caine had survived. Now, don't get me wrong, the following sequence had some beautiful animation, with it flipping back and forth between the simplified version seen at the beginning of episode 8 and Caine in the Void, slowly gaining his powers back. The animation is something I don't think I or anyone else could really ever knock the show for. My particular issues with Caine's revival, though, come with the how and the what next. Now, I've seen a couple people here and there on the internet try to hand-wave away Caine's survival as him simply being put in the trash bin. While that is a funny image, I cannot imagine in any conceivable metric that Caine would take up such a small file space. Apparently the neural scans do, which, okay, but Caine? It's not a secret how much storage space certain programs can take up, and if any of you have ever deleted one of those programs, you would be more than aware that if they're too big, then they just get poofed. No chance for recovery. But, okay, maybe Caine does only take up like a megabyte or something. Alright, fine, whatever. It still doesn't change my opinion in thinking his redemption is incredibly contrived. Him changing for the better essentially amounted to having a short conversation with himself and then deciding to lobotomize himself. Hell, to me, this could have been an entire episode all to itself. But instead, we get Caine walking right back into the circus, saying sorry, and then putting on that slideshow for the cast. Maybe if Caine needed to let himself be deleted or something to recover the cast's memories, then maybe it would have left less of a sour taste in my mouth. However, that's not what happened. Hi, editing me here to come in and just give a little 2 cents that I'm a little wrong here in that Caine kind of did sacrifice himself for the circus. He essentially had the same choice the cast did in episode 7 to leave the circus or stay with them forever, which cool, I guess. I don't know. I still, it's still kind of like, okay, so Caine gets to live, the guy who actually tormented them, and I don't know, but I don't know. It's like, I don't know. If Caine got to live and Jax didn't, then it's still bitter to me. I don't know. What makes this worse for me is that I really did enjoy Caine's slow descent into madness over the course of the show. I've read I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream on several occasions, both before and during the series, and while I do understand the tragedy of Am, I found Caine's heel turn to be so much more personable and heart-wrenching. Being able to see just how much it hurt Caine to truly be incapable of understanding the humans who he adored so much lended itself in really digging that knife in. He was living a paradox, one of his own egotistical creation. Having said all of that, while I'm not particularly fond of Caine's presence as a character in the last act, I absolutely loved what it meant for the themes of the show. And funnily enough, it ties back to episode 5, where we see Caine first participating in one of their adventures. The bar scene in Untitled is without a doubt one of the most unassuming moments in the show. Despite being one of the proposed adventures, the scene doesn't even get a title card. All it is just the cast sitting around a bar, shooting the shit. However, it is also the most telling when it comes to the show's themes. While the scene does make you question if some of these characters have ever actually had a conversation outside of the episode, it helps to reveal the sort of places the characters were in mentally before they entered the circus. For Pomni, she found her life boring, stuck working an accountant position for a supermarket chain of all things. Gangle herself had her passion for art and her own dreams squeezed out of her by the realities of life, which is heavily implied to have led her to contemplate or even attempt in the real world. And Ragatha, trapped under the thumb of an overbearing and potentially abusive mother, didn't even think she would be missed. The through line for all of them is clear to see. All of them, in some way, shape, or form, were living out stagnant lives before entering the circus, which is why it was necessary for Caine to reveal how their real selves continue to live after taking off the headset. Because despite all of the struggles each of them dealt with in their lives, things did get better for them. Not only had they been capable of finding meaning in the circus, but they had also been able to free themselves from the cycles of pain, abuse, and monotony that had driven them to putting on the headset in the first place. Abigail's channel was beginning to blow up, and she was making friends to join her along the way. Susie cut ties with her mother and was more successful than ever. Riley had opened their own bar where anyone could find belonging, and Zoe had managed to recover and even begun work on her own manga series. Unfortunately, this final revelation also leaves the cast off with a bitter note, because Ribbit had been right. Jax, or Leroy Mateo in the real world, hadn't killed their mother as they feared they had. Otherwise, I highly doubt they would have been able to find a job as a delivery person. In fact, things seemed to be going better for Leroy than they ever had before. They too had forged new ties and, ironically enough, often frequented Riley's bar with the friends they had made, more than likely being attracted to the location's core value of being true to who you are, something that Jax never allowed themselves to be. Over the past 2 weeks since the episode's release in theaters, there has been a lot of debate around the show's conclusion, and to be honest, I can understand why. There was a lot Goose was trying to say, but they didn't give themselves a whole lot of time to say it. The show being a limited series with only 9 episodes didn't leave a whole lot of room for any fat. Some plot and character details weren't given as much room to get comfortable as others, and I do feel that people rightfully are allowed to be somewhat nettled over that. However, I do believe that much of the episode's divisiveness comes from people not engaging the material properly. Now, I do have a lot I would want to say on that, like how some people apparently don't understand what a narrative foil is, but this video is already going to be pretty lengthy by the time I have to actually sit down and edit it. So, as I do wrap up the video though, it would be pretty pertinent for me to go back to the start. After all of my time spent with the Digital Circus, theorizing over it, discussing episodes with friends, avoiding the fandom like the plague, I truly do believe that the show came out at the perfect time. And it was the scene with the characters learning about how their lives went on that sealed it for me. In a way, with how the moment was built up to, it was designed less for the characters and more for us, the audience. I've seen my fair share of people who've made it perfectly clear how thrilled they would be were they to be trapped in a situation like the circus. Oh, don't have to worry about taxes or healthcare costs and you get to go on wacky adventures? Sign me up! These are the people that this scene is meant to be speaking to. Things can and will get better. You don't have to run away. With even just a little effort, you can push yourself farther than you could have ever imagined. There's still meaning to be found, even if the world as it is weighing us down, to the point where sometimes it feels crushing. Strive. Fight. Because even on the darkest nights, the moon still reminds us that the sun is waiting to see us again.